Okay, so we're going to be reading from Psychological Types once again. Okay, we're going to go a little bit more in depth today with the two types that Jung observed, the introverted type and the extroverted type. So this video will be covering more in-depth definitions of what those are alongside each other, and then we can do individual ones at a later date. So this is the introduction of psychological types. Plato and Aristotle, these are not merely two systems, they are also types of two distinct human natures, which from immemorial time, under every sort of cloak, stand more or less amically oppressed. But preeminently, the whole medieval period was riven by this conflict, persisting even to the present day. Moreover, this battle is the most essential content of the history of the Christian Church, though under different names, always and essentially it is of Plato and Aristotle that we speak. Enthusiastic, mystical, Platonic natures reveal Christian ideas and their corresponding symbols from the bottomless depth of their souls. Practical, ordering, Aristotelian natures build up from these ideas and symbols a solid system, a dogma, and a cult. The Church eventually embraces both natures, one of them sheltering among the clergy, while the other finds refuge in monasticism, yet both incessantly at feud. And that was a quote by H. Hein in his book Deutschland. Right, so the idea that, I think he's kind of saying that Plato is the epitome of introversion, and Aristotle is the epitome of extroversion, and Aristotelian natures are interested in building symbols into a system and dogma and a cult as well, he says here. And Plato is actually interested in the symbols rather than making a system out of it or a religion out of it, I guess. Is that the thing that makes a distinction between extroverted and introverted types? The introvert kind of swims around in ideas. He swims around in the symbols. And the extrovert says, okay, I see your symbols. Let's see what we can do with them in the real world. I don't know, maybe not, maybe we'll see. So here's Jung. In my practical medical work with nervous patients, I have long been struck by the fact that among the many individual differences in human psychology, there exist also typical distinctions. Two types especially became clear to me, which I have termed the introversion and the extroversion types. When we reflect upon human history, we see how the destinies of one individual are conditioned more by the objects of his interest, while in another they are conditioned more by his own inner self, by his subject. Since, therefore, we all swerve rather more towards one side than the other, we are naturally disposed to understand everything in the sense of our own type. I mention this circumstance at this point to prevent possible subsequent misunderstandings. As may well be understood, this basic condition considerably aggravates the difficulty of a general description of the types. I must presume a considerable benevolence on the part of the reader, if I may hope to be rightly understood. It would be relatively simple if every reader himself knew to which category he belonged, but it is often a difficult matter to discover to which type an individual belongs, especially when one's self is in question. Judgment in relation to one's own personality is indeed always extraordinarily clouded. This subjective clouding of judgment is, therefore, a frequent, if not constant, factor, for in every pronounced type there exists a special tendency towards compensation for the one-sidedness of his type, a tendency which is biologically expedient, since it is a constant effort to maintain psychic equilibrium. Our accuracy of judgment is clouded by the fact that our psyches are constantly trying to balance themselves out. So what I'm getting from that is that the psyche may choose something other than accuracy or the full picture, because what's more important to the psyche at that point in time is balancing between the functions, shall we say. So what that person needs, and the psyche knows that person needs something other than just cold, rational accuracy at that point. So it's almost like saying you can't blame people for doing what they do, because at the center of it all is a psyche that's desperately trying to balance itself. Like, have you ever had a thought that comes in and kind of, and it's there almost to cushion the blow, kind of get you out of cognitive dissonance? If you're like, oh, I've just realized this really hard truth about the world, and I think I'm going to have an existential crisis now. And then another thought comes in and goes, don't worry about it, maybe you should see it in this way instead. And then you kind of go, yeah, okay. And you get on with your day and you don't have your existential crisis. It kind of reminds me of that type of idea. That's why, we should always question the validity of our thoughts. But then in doing that, are we opening doors for more extreme thoughts to come in and balance the psyche out? It's almost like I'm starting to feel like we don't want to tinker too much with it, Through compensation, there arise secondary characters or types, which present a picture that is extraordinarily hard to decipher, so difficult indeed that one is even inclined to deny the existence of types in general and to believe only in individual differences. I must emphasize this difficulty in order to justify a certain peculiarity in my later presentation, for it might seem as though a simpler way would be to describe two concrete cases and to lay out their dissections one beside the other. But every individual possesses both mechanisms, extraversion as well as introversion, and only the relative predominance of the one or the other determines the type. Hence, in order to bring out the necessary relief in the picture, one would have to retouch it rather vigorously, which would certainly amount to a more or less pious fraud. Moreover, the psychological reaction of a human being is such a complicated matter that my descriptive ability would indeed hardly suffice to give an absolutely correct picture of it. From sheer necessity, therefore, I must confine myself to a presentation of principles which I have abstracted from an abundance of observed facts. In this there is no question of deductio a priori, as it might well appear. It is rather a deductive presentation of empirically gained understanding. It is my hope that this insight may prove a clarifying contribution to a dilemma which, not in analytical psychology alone, but also in other provinces of science, and especially in the personal relations of human beings to one another, has led and still continues to lead to misunderstanding and division, for it explains how the existence of two distinct types is actually a fact that has long been known, a fact that in one form or another has dawned upon the observer of human nature, or shed light upon the brooding reflection of the thinker, presenting itself, for example, the Goethe's intuition as the embracing principle of systole and diastole. I have to look those up. The names and forms in which the mechanism of introversion and extroversion has been conceived are extremely diverse and are, as a rule, adapted only to the standpoint of the individual observer. Notwithstanding the diversity of the formulations, the common basis or fundamental idea shines constantly through, namely, in the one case, an outward movement of interest toward the object, and in the other, a movement of interest away from the object, towards the subject and his own psychological processes. Okay, so that's what we talked about in the last couple of videos. He's saying here, there's throughout history there's been an idea of introversion and extroversion, the introverted and extroverted types. You can see it in historical writings, religious texts, whatever, philosophical writings. And he is now saying that he is presenting this idea because of that and his empirically gained understanding, which obviously means what he's observed over the years in his patients. Okay, so he's attempting to bring empiricism to like an archaic idea of introversion and extroversion. So here he's saying, remember, extroversion, the person's focus or interest goes towards the object. In introversion, the person's focus or interest comes away from the object and into themselves. I'm not yet sure whether when we talk about objects, we're only talking about external objects, or whether introversion does actually include objects, but they're internal objects. I'm not that clear on that yet. I do know that it explains it, though, at some point when we get through it all. In the first case, the object works like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject. This is in extroversion. It is, therefore, an attraction that to a large extent determines the subject. It even alienates him from himself. His qualities may become so transformed in the sense of assimilation to the object that one could imagine the object to possess an extreme and even decisive significance for the subject. It might also seem as though it were an absolute determination, a special purpose of life, or fate that he should abandon himself wholly to the object. But in the latter case, the subject is and remains the centre of interest. This is in introversion. It looks, one might say, as though all the life energy were ultimately seeking subject, thus offering a constant hindrance to any overpowering influence on the part of the object. It is as though energy were flowing away from the object, as if the subject were a magnet which would draw the object to itself. It is not easy to characterize this contrasting relationship to the object in a way that is lucid and intelligible. There is, in fact, a great danger of reaching quite paradoxical formulations which would create more confusion than clarity. Quite generally, one could describe the introverted standpoint as one that, under all circumstances, sets the self and the subject psychological processes above the object and the objective process, or at any rate hold its ground against the object. This attitude, therefore, gives the subject a higher value than the object. As a result, the object always possesses a lower value. It has secondary importance. Occasionally, it even represents merely an outward objective token of a subjective content. The embodiment of an idea, in other words, in which, however, the idea is the essential factor, or it is the object of a feeling where, however, the feeling experience is the chief thing and not the object in its own individuality. Okay. That was hard for me to read. I couldn't comprehend as I was going along. But an introvert's attitude to objects, let's call them external objects, okay? So he might recoil away from it and go back into himself. Or he might perceive the object and then feel a certain way, and then the focus becomes on his feeling. Or the object might remind him of concepts or memories of experiences or anything that's already there in his mind. The object kind of reminds him of that, and then he goes to what's already stored in there. So he is placing higher value on his subjectiveness, or the subject, than the object. And I'm guessing the extrovert will be placing higher value on the on the object. The extroverted standpoint, on the contrary, sets the subject below the object, whereby the object receives the predominant value. The subject always has secondary importance. The subjective process appears at times merely as a disturbing or superfluous accessory to objective events. It is plain that the psychology resulting from these antagonistic standpoints must be distinguished as two totally different orientations. The one sees everything from the angle of his conception, the other from the viewpoint of the objective occurrence. These opposite attitudes are merely opposite mechanisms, a diastolic going out and seizing of the object, and a systolic concentration and release of energy from the object seized. Every human being possesses both mechanisms as an expression of his natural life rhythm. That rhythm, which goeth, surely not by chance, characterized with the physiological concepts of cardiac activity, a rhythmical alternation of both forms of psychic activity may correspond with the normal course of life, but the complicated external conditions under which we live, as well as the presumably even more complex conditions of our individual psychic disposition, seldom permit a completely undisturbed flow of our psychic activity. Hence, there can never occur a pure type in the sense that he is entirely possessed of the one mechanism with a complete atrophy of the other. So you can see where the idea in MBTI and socionics and other typing systems, the idea that you have either an introverted or extroverted function that dominates, and then you also have you must by necessity have an auxiliary function or a second function that is of the opposite type to the first one. So if you've got your first one is an introverted function, the second one has to be extroverted, and vice versa. So I think this is the beginning of that idea. A typical attitude always signifies the merely relative predominance of one mechanism. With the substantiation of introversion and extroversion, an opportunity at once offered itself for the differentiation of two extensive groups of psychological individuals, but this grouping is of such a superficial and inclusive nature that it permits no more than a rather general discrimination. A more exact investigation of those individual psychologies which fall into either group at once yields great differences between individuals who nonetheless belong to the same group. If therefore we wish to determine wherein lie the differences of individuals belonging to a definite group, we must make a further step. My experience has taught me that individuals can quite generally be differentiated not only by the universal difference of extra and introversion, but also according to the individual basic psychological functions. For in the same measure as outer circumstances and inner disposition respectively promote a predominance of extraversion or introversion, they also favour the predominance of one definite basic function in the individual. As basic functions, i.e., functions which are both genuinely as well as essentially differentiated from other functions, there exists thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Okay, so he's saying the types. So you're either an extroverted or introverted type, depending on what you do most of the time. And then you also are a type according to one of these categories: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. To be an extroverted or introverted form of one of those, hence 8 functions or 8 types. If one of those functions habitually prevails, a corresponding type results. I therefore discriminate thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuitive types. Every one of these types can moreover be introverted or extroverted, according to his relation to the object in the way described above. In 2 former communications, and there's a footnote, he's referring here to some papers that he wrote previously. So in these former 2 papers that I wrote concerning psychological types, I did not carry out the distinction outlined above, but identified the thinking type with the introvert and the feeling type with the extrovert. That's interesting. Okay, so before he wrote this book, he was saying that there's extroverted and introverted types, and the introverted types are all thinkers, and the extroverted types are all feelers. A deeper elaboration of the problem proved this combination to be untenable. To avoid misunderstandings, I would therefore ask the reader to bear in mind the distinction here developed. In order to ensure the clarity which is essential in such complicated things, I have denoted the last chapter of the book to the definitions of my psychological concepts. Okay, there's a lot to ponder there, a lot to take in. So it'd be really lovely to know people's thoughts or corrections or musings or ponderings or questions, but I'm doing my best to answer those. But I'm just learning at the same time as you are. So okay, that was the whole of the introduction. So after that we'll dive into chapter 1, I guess. Okay, thanks for listening.